On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler remained in his East Prussian headquarters while issuing a decisive opinion on America that would ultimately determine Germany's destiny. He informed his senior advisors that he held little regard for America's prospects. According to him, it was a nation in decay. Hitler cited their racial issues and social inequality as major problems. In his assessment, the conduct of American society demonstrated that it was partly Judaized, with the other part influenced by African American culture. He questioned how a country structured in such a manner could remain unified. Approximately 7,000 miles distant, in a modest office within a Richmond, California shipyard, 57-year-old industrial magnate Henry Kaiser was doodling on hotel stationery. Kaiser had no prior experience in ship construction. His previous achievements included building dams, highways, and bridges. However, shipbuilding presented unique challenges. Ships were inherently intricate. The conventional shipbuilding sector maintained it took 8 months to construct a cargo ship. After inspecting what he had drawn, Kaiser told his associates they would finish one in 4 days. While Hitler perceived Americans as weak, Kaiser was preparing to demonstrate their resilience in a way that would dramatically overturn German assumptions. The miscalculation had actually begun before any hostilities broke out. In the period prior to war, German military intelligence put together reports detailing American industrial ability, military preparedness, and societal temperament. The findings across these reports showed remarkable uniformity. The perception held was that America consisted of entrepreneurs and shoppers, not fighting men. In 1939, its armed forces ranked as one of the world's smallest, actually smaller than Portugal's. U.S. factories specialized in producing cars and refrigerators rather than tanks or airplanes. Its citizens, accustomed to a long era of peace, appeared unready for major sacrifices. Advisors briefed Hitler that the reported numbers in American war output were pure propaganda. When President Franklin Roosevelt declared in May 1940 that the U.S. would manufacture 50,000 planes annually, Germany's top brass simply mocked the claim as impossible. In 1939, the total number of American military aircraft produced was fewer than 3,000. The suggestion of multiplying that figure by a factor of nearly 20 seemed preposterous. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest aides, shared this disdain. Göring had established the German Air Force from scratch, transforming it into the most formidable aviation power in Europe. He understood the requirements for modern warplane production: precision in engineering, use of specialized metals, reliance on a well-trained labor force, and years devoted to optimizing assembly practices. In Göring's view, America lacked all these advantages. The prospect of the U.S. creating an air fleet out of its car factories struck him as absurd. Germany's generals had already faced American troops. In World War I's closing year, Americans arrived in France and performed satisfactorily, but they entered the conflict late, endured fewer casualties compared to Europeans, and had little influence on overall strategic outcomes. The recollection of those inexperienced doughboys only reinforced beliefs that Americans lacked the courage for extended warfare. Albert Speer, future Minister of Armaments, attended many of Hitler's mealtime conversations about the U.S. Hitler reasoned that America's involvement in the 1914 to 1918 conflict had been minimal. He insisted their blood sacrifices were insubstantial. He felt sure Americans could not survive true hardship, since their martial prowess was, as he said, quite low. Generally, Hitler believed the concept of an American nation was unfounded. He argued that the U.S. population was merely a collection of various immigrant backgrounds and races. This sort of racial reasoning played a central part in Hitler's philosophy. He maintained that the strength of a nation came from racial purity and uniformity. Germany's supposed Aryan ancestry purportedly provided them a natural battlefield advantage. In his eyes, the U.S. a blend of immigrants, Jews, and black citizens could never display the military spirit he attributed to the German Volk. Yet the German evaluation contained a critical error. They assessed America's wartime potential by looking solely at its peacetime record. Observing a nation not yet mobilized, they determined it lacked the ability to do so. Witnessing plants making consumer items, they concluded these could not be repurposed for weapons production. Observing America's diversity, they judged this caused weakness. Their conclusions turned out to be wrong on every count. The change actually started before America was formally at war. In the summer of 1940, with France conquered and Britain besieged, Roosevelt called upon American manufacturers to accomplish what he labeled a production miracle. Automobile assembly lines would cease output of passenger cars. Appliance factories would halt refrigerator manufacture. Every machine tool, press, and assembly conveyor in the nation was to be retooled for war. This development was more than motivational rhetoric. It amounted to a structural transformation of the entire American economy. In 1941, domestic automakers produced over 3 million vehicles. Over the ensuing 4 years, only 139 more were completed. The whole automobile sector shifted toward the fabrication of weaponry. Chrysler constructed fuselages. General Motors manufactured aircraft engines, armaments, trucks, and armored vehicles. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for Britain's Air Force. Firms formerly engaged in household appliance production learned how to produce ammunition. The speed of this turnaround was impressive since American industry possessed advantages German observers never fully appreciated. Central to American manufacturing was standardization and the use of interchangeable components. U.S. factories had devised mass production systems ensuring that parts from distinct plants could be combined without issue. A carburetor crafted in Ohio could be connected flawlessly to an engine constructed in Michigan, then installed in a vehicle put together in California. This technique of interchangeable components, honed for decades in civilian markets, was now dedicated to military output. Critics maintained this could not possibly succeed. They claimed that an airplane could not be produced like a car. The detailed specifications required for aircraft assembly, they believed, were far too demanding. A single heavy bomber contained well over 1 million parts. By comparison, an automobile comprised about 15,000. Henry Kaiser tuned out detractors. In December 1940, he obtained a government contract obligating him to produce 30 cargo ships for Britain. He was devoid of shipyard facilities. He lacked know-how in naval construction. He had no labor force skilled in marine trades. What he did have was an efficient system. This methodology proved to be crucial. Rather than adopting the conventional viewpoint of treating shipbuilding as a craft, Kaiser approached it as an engineering and manufacturing challenge. Whether the end result was a vessel, dam, or highway did not concern him so much as the processes involved. Any complex process could be analyzed, organized into its constituent steps, refined, and increased in scale. Traditional shipbuilders relied on lengthy apprenticeships for skill development. A master riveter would take years to reach proficiency. Kaiser, pressed for time, developed systems that new workers could learn within days. He substituted machinery for skilled manual labor when feasible. Capital investments funded equipment that replaced erstwhile handwork. The established shipbuilding interests contested that this approach would be ineffective. They argued that ships were too complex and that inexperience would yield disaster at sea. Contrary to their predictions, Kaiser's vessels not only emerged from the yards more rapidly but also achieved superior quality standards. The defect rate at the facilities under his control was less than half that found at conventional yards. The same disciplined process that hastened output also improved product quality. Kaiser employed logistics models and organizational schemes first proven on the Hoover Dam. He subdivided a ship's construction into manageable modules. Instead of building the vessel from the base upward in a single spot, he advocated prefabricating entire segments elsewhere, then assembling them like oversized building blocks. He implemented welding rather than riveting as it was quicker and demanded less skilled manpower. Kaiser drew employees from all corners of the country, erected residences for them, provided child care services, and launched a health program to keep his workforce efficient. Transformation of everyday people into competent shipbuilders advanced with exceptional speed. Individuals, both male and female, who had never witnessed the ocean, handled a welding torch, or entered a factory environment prior, learned the shipbuilding trade in a matter of weeks. Kaiser's training initiatives proved extremely effective. New hires became capable welders within 10 days. Within 30, they functioned as productive contributors within teams. Labor came from across the spectrum. Oklahoma farmers displaced by drought, industrial workers from Detroit let go during the Depression, women unfamiliar with formal employment, and Black Americans in search of opportunities unavailable in the segregated South. At its peak, the workforce of the Richmond shipyards managed by Kaiser surpassed 90,000, nearly a third of whom were women. The contributions of women in these industrial roles came to represent the American wartime mobilization ethos. Women drilled holes, welded bulkheads, and set up wiring work considered exclusively male before wartime. The U.S. government showcased these employees on posters and in videos portraying strong, resourceful women at work, turning them into central icons for the home front effort. America had thousands of women like these, found in shipyards and airplane plants, illustrating workforce expansion far exceeding German planning assumptions. Old line shipbuilders observed all this in astonishment. Their methods had not changed in generations. They were convinced they knew the limits of production. Kaiser's techniques transgressed long-established norms. Conventional wisdom dictated ships should be riveted and built entirely on slipways, with crews trained over years. However, Kaiser's systems achieved unprecedented results. In 1941, a standard Liberty cargo ship required 230 days to build. Within a year, Kaiser's operations had cut this number to 45 days, then just 30, and soon as little as 20. In November 1942, at his Richmond facility, the Liberty ship named Robert E. Peary was constructed and launched in 4 days and 15 hours. Building and readying the vessel for launch took less time than a German U-boat's typical Atlantic crossing. The new pace of ship construction created a major strategic headache for Germany. Admiral Karl Dönitz, leader of the German U-boat arm, had fixed his campaign around a key formula. His subs must destroy Allied shipping more quickly than replacements could reach the water. For the early part of 1942, this approach appeared successful. German submarines during their so-called second, happy time, roamed the American coastline, sinking hundreds of ships visible from land. Oil tankers burned near Florida. Cargo ships went down with New Jersey's beaches as a backdrop. Reinhard Hartigan, captain of U-123, was one of the first to operate off American shores. In January 1942, he fired torpedoes close enough to land to see city lights reflected in the columns of smoke. The U.S. had yet to implement blackout measures or organize its merchant ships into convoys, virtually making them easy prey. Hartigan destroyed 8 ships on his initial patrol and returned to Germany hailed as a success. Others followed his lead. Over the first half of 1942, nearly 400 merchant ships fell to German submarines along America's coast. The damage was severe. Oil originally intended for Allied tanks washed ashore on Atlantic beaches. Food supplies bound for Britain decayed underwater. Critical war materials were lost at sea. Dönitz was convinced he was prevailing. Losses exceeded even his most optimistic forecasts. Continuation of such sinkings hoped to sever Britain's supply line and undermine the American war effort before it could truly build momentum. Nonetheless, just as U-boats claimed increasing victims, American shipyards ramped up their output. In 1942, the U.S. delivered 8 million tons of new ship capacity. The following year, this figure more than doubled to 19 million tons. By autumn 1943, new launches outpaced German sinkings for the first time. Every vessel lost to U-boats was replaced by 2, sometimes more. Dönitz, watching the situation grow more dire, saw his U-boat force sinking tonnage that would have resulted in victory had this been World War I. This, however, was not the earlier war. The Germans now confronted an adversary with productive assets beyond anything they had previously imagined. The arithmetic offered no mercy. Dönitz determined that his U-boat fleet had to destroy 700,000 tons of Allied shipping each month in order to cripple Britain. In 1942, that figure was nearly achieved. By 1943, however, U.S. shipyards alone began turning out over 1 million tons of shipping every month. The objective consistently shifted, always eluding grasp, always slipping further away. An even greater challenge was the Americans' adaptation. The disastrous losses off the eastern seaboard had highlighted inadequacies in anti-submarine methods. Convoy formations were put in place. Air patrols began flying over shipping routes. Innovative tools like radar and advanced sonar now gave the defense capabilities previously absent. In May 1943, Dönitz had no choice but to pull his U-boats from the Atlantic. Just 1 month saw the loss of 43 submarines. The amount of shipping destroyed had dropped so far it no longer justified the steep submarine casualties. Germany's effort to win the Battle of the Atlantic and choke off Britain had failed. Submarine crews who came back from the May catastrophe to bases in occupied France were stunned. They had left port believing themselves to be winning the war. They returned, realizing their campaign had failed. The never-ending lines of merchant ships they had preyed upon now moved in convoys too well protected for engagement. Allied patrol planes, once rare, now seemed omnipresent. The Germans' technological advantage at sea had fully vanished. What happened in the Atlantic was mirrored in the skies above. The Willow Run plant operated by Ford Motor Company near Detroit became an icon of U.S. industrial strength. The plant, created by the prominent industrial designer Albert Kahn, spanned 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest single-roof factory in existence. It had been built to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber representing greater complexity than any prior Ford product. The production obstacles were formidable. With over 1 million components and 300,000 rivets in 550 types, the B-24 demanded an artisanal precision never before attempted by automobile workers. Ford's production manager, Charles Sorensen, examined Consolidated's aircraft building practices and judged them outmoded. Bombers were constructed outdoors, individually, with methods virtually unchanged in decades. Sorensen suggested a dramatic overhaul, constructing bombers as cars were assembled, on a moving production line. Skeptics derided the concept. Dutch Kindleberger, head of North American aviation, remarked that it was foolish to expect a blacksmith to create a fine watch overnight. These doubts made sense. Aircraft assembly was a fundamentally different discipline than car manufacturing. Automobiles could function with minor differences. Even a subtle flaw in an airplane might be fatal. Margins for error measured just thousandths of an inch. The required metals were rare alloys, nothing like those used in cars. The hydraulics, electrics, and pneumatic systems all had to work faultlessly at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet in freezing cold. Early in the process, Ford ran into serious difficulties. Ongoing design changes from the government continually disrupted the production line. Completely new skill sets had to be mastered by workers. Newspapers lampooned the site as "Will it run?" rather than "Willow Run." Senator Harry Truman launched an inquiry into the factory's slow pace, casting doubt on Ford's capacity to meet its obligations. The setbacks were genuine. Consolidated, responsible for the B-24's design, repeatedly revised the bomber based on frontline feedback. Every modification compelled Ford to alter production tools. Dies costing thousands were rendered obsolete in a day. Proficient workers needed retraining for new methods. Ford answered back with stubborn resolve. 200 engineers were dedicated to round-the-clock work, transforming Consolidated's hand-drawn plans into exact specifications. Each day brought 5 miles of new technical drawings. If new revisions made those plans unusable before implementation, Ford's engineers restarted without hesitation or protest. Decentralization was another change. Instead of assembling full aircraft at Willow Run, Ford devised a web of contractors who provided parts, which were then brought into the main plant for assembly. Flint's Buick division supplied engines. Hamilton Standard in Connecticut shipped the propellers. Goodyear in Ohio sent the landing gear. The sheer logistical scale would have overwhelmed any business lacking deep supply chain expertise. By 1944, the difficulties were ironed out. Willow Run was turning out a completed B-24 every 63 minutes. The production peak came in April 1944, when the factory finished 453 bombers in just 30 days. Between April 24 and 26, 100 B-24 bombers departed Willow Run in only 72 hours. Employees worked 2 9-hour shifts daily across 6 days weekly. The remaining 6 hours each day were used for resupplying, tool modifications, and machine maintenance. Despite the frenetic tempo, the workforce was trimmed from 42,000 to just 17,000 as output became more efficient. More bombers could be produced with fewer hands. Finally, the Army Air Forces had to instruct Ford to decrease production, as available storage for aircraft was exhausted. Training bases filled to capacity, B-24s waiting for crews to take them up. The output capability was greater than the military's ability to bring the planes into service. At the same time, total American warplane production reached heights the German leadership had dismissed as unattainable. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories assembled over 96,000 military aircraft. That single year exceeded Japan's aircraft outputs for the entire Second World War. Nearly 300,000 aircraft in total rolled off U.S. assembly lines from 1940 to 1945, supplying roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The numbers seemed unimaginable. The U.S. produced more planes in just a month at peak output than Germany had possessed at the beginning of war. Production lines worked around the clock, all week, every week. Worker shifts changed at midnight, at noon, and again at noon. The machinery never ceased. The scope of these numbers becomes clear when translated to physical terms. With 300,000 aircraft placed wingtip to wingtip, the line would cover 30,000 miles, encircling the globe at the equator. The fuel for these aircraft required a full infrastructure of refineries, pipelines, and tankers all dedicated to making aviation gas. The people flying them needed a training system that rapidly turned hundreds of thousands of civilians into combat-ready pilots, usually in under a year. Mobilization in America went further than just what statistics revealed. Behind every plane, ship, or vehicle, a supply line stretched all the way back to global sources, mines, forests, and agriculture across the continent. Aluminum was refined from bauxite transported from South America. Rubber was sourced from plantations in Brazil and Liberia after Asia's supplies were lost due to Japanese conquest. Uniform cotton was raised on southern farms. Food was grown in the American heartland. The entire national economy redirected its focus to supporting war needs. Women with no prior experience outside the home learned how to use machinery their mothers never encountered. African Americans migrated north into factory roles previously denied to them. People from rural America traveled to industrial cities where housing shortages meant families hop-bunked, swapping beds as day and night workers rotated. The shift in society was as significant as the industrial one. Germans saw the results of this era in the skies above Europe. Their aviators counted among the best prepared worldwide. Their fighters, including the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, were technically impressive. In direct combat, German pilots often outperformed the Americans. The first U.S. bomber crews were woefully inexperienced. Numerous pilots had fewer than 300 total flight hours before starting missions. Navigational slip-ups sent formations far off their intended path. Bombing accuracy lagged. Cooperation with escort fighters invariably fell short. German airmen exploited these flaws mercilessly. The Luftwaffe designed tactics specifically to disrupt bomber groups and take down stragglers. Direct assaults at over 600 miles per hour meant American gunners had minimal time to respond. Germany's air forces built fighters with rockets able to strike from beyond U.S. machine gun range. Nonetheless, attritional losses ground them down. For each German plane destroyed, the Americans could field 3 new aircraft. For each skilled Luftwaffe airman lost, the Americans trained and produced 5. Germany's air force was gradually worn away, not by a knockout blow, but by the overwhelming replacement capacity of its opponent. American pilot training was a vast enterprise. Cadet classes reached into the thousands simultaneously. Instructors ran numerous sorties every single day. Abundant planes trainers as well as combat aircraft all rolled out of the same factories. The whole arrangement targeted maximum output, moving recruits through the system methodically. The Luftwaffe was losing some 25% of its flyers and 40% of its aircraft, each month by mid-1944. Those levels of attrition could not be endured. The Reich's claim of a 1,000-year lifespan could not be matched by an endless supply of pilots. German flyers who had started the conflict with extensive instruction and flying time were replaced by men who saw only a few weeks of training and a handful of flying hours. Throughout 1944, Luftwaffe pilot experience diminished steadily. At the war's end, some were making a combat debut with fewer than 100 hours total flight. Meanwhile, American proficiency advanced. Early bomber groups had been far from experienced, but battle survivors from 1943 took on the training of the crews in 1944. Procedures were updated, equipment was modernized. With its superior range and performance, the P-51 Mustang gave bomber groups the fighter cover they needed. Misjudgment by Germany extended past the factories and reached to evaluations of American military effectiveness. In February 1943, American troops engaged the Germans for the first time during the fight at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The outcome played into long-standing German opinion. The Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel blew through American defenses with decisive speed. Units fell back in disorder. Material was left on the field. Command structures unraveled. Losses passed 6,000 men on the American side. Certain German commanders, who had thought little of U.S. troops, now had field evidence for their disdain. American units were untested in ways only combat can reveal. Many U.S. soldiers fired their weapons in actual conflict for the first time there. Officers, long groomed in peacetime roles, struggled under real battle pressure. Communication through radio failed. Infantry and armor neglected to support each other. Rather than combining power, units operated separately. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, married to General Patton's daughter, became one of many captured. He had led an armored counterassault near Sidi Bou Zid, only to face well-dug-in German panzers and anti-tank gunners in a textbook ambush. U.S. tanks caught fire, and infantry units scattered. Waters was shot, taken prisoner, and spent the remainder of the conflict in captivity. Similar stories recurred across the area. U.S. artillery was misplaced. Soldiers dug foxholes in places that offered little protection. Armor attacks went forward without proper scouting. German veterans, hardened by 2 years fighting in North Africa, capitalized on every misstep with methodical accuracy. Rommel at first looked down on these inexperienced Americans. Compared with his British adversaries of the previous 2 years, U.S. soldiers seemed less disciplined and poorly commanded. The calamity at Kasserine reinforced the belief among Germans that U.S. numerical and material advantages could not outweigh German battlefield superiority. German intelligence compiled reports of the fight which matched Hitler's assumptions about American softness. The wealth of U.S. material was acknowledged, but German analysts concluded that morale and military prowess would carry the day. Nevertheless, Rommel was experienced enough not to let early opinions become lasting convictions. He observed the events that followed at Kasserine and found them unsettling. The Americans bounced back with astonishing rapidity. Within a matter of weeks after the setback, they reorganized their units, replaced ineffective leaders, and brutally applied hard-won lessons. General George Patton assumed control of the disheartened Second Corps and reformed it through sheer determination. Their tactics saw marked advancement. There was stronger integration among infantry, tanks, and artillery. Air support achieved greater efficiency. Patton acted like a force of nature, descending upon the Second Corps with the intensity of a thunderstorm, insisting on discipline, punishing carelessness, and pushing his troops towards standards they had never previously attained. Those who had previously slouched through the disaster at Kasserine found themselves diligently polishing their brass, standing rigidly at attention, and training with unprecedented rigor. Yet, Patton's impact went beyond simply enforcing order. He analyzed the roots of American failure and applied targeted changes. Artillery forward observers found themselves in new positions. Tank tactics underwent significant revision. Infantry units were trained to synchronize more precisely with armored forces. The Kasserine lessons were systematically assessed, recorded, and distributed. The American military's structure included a systemic drive to learn from setbacks, something the Germans did not appreciate. Following Kasserine, the ground forces commander, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, led a comprehensive review into the failures, and his conclusions were forwarded to training centers across the U.S., influencing the instruction of divisions yet to see combat. Errors made in February 1943 formed the training foundation for March 1943. RML would later commit his remarks to record. He wrote that the enemy's tactical defense had been exemplary, rebounding swiftly after the initial shock and soon blocking further German progress. Contrary to the attitude of many German officers, RML avoided underestimating how rapidly Americans absorbed lessons from their errors. Historian Carlo d'Este, who examined RML's documents, pointed out that the Desert Fox recognized an essential shift in the American forces following Kasserine. Their situation had quickly improved. RML wrote, "Although true marvels of mobile warfare did not appear until the Patton Army in France, even after the first failure, I realized I was observing an adversary who would only become more capable." By May 1943, 90 days after Kasserine, the campaign in North Africa was finished. A total of 275,000 German and Italian troops surrendered and were detained in POW camps, surpassing the number captured at Stalingrad. Now, those Americans previously panicked at Kasserine stood among the victors. The swiftness of the American comeback startled German military leaders who had anticipated a much longer period of demoralization. Their experience led them to believe that defeated units required months, not weeks, to regain their effectiveness. The Americans managed restoration in a matter of weeks. The morale and tenacity they demonstrated were, to the Germans, even more disturbing than their material resources. German prisoners taken in Tunisia remarked about their surprise at the American supply system. Facing them in battle, U.S. troops always appeared to have an endless stock of ammunition, fuel, and rations. When Germans experienced shortages, improvisation was their only option. By contrast, American shortages were remedied in days. German intelligence officers studying the North African operations understood the implication. For the Americans, material superiority offset any lack of experience. While the Americans were tactically bested at Kasserine, their output always exceeded German production. As long as U.S. industry kept running, American forces kept advancing. The crucial question was if Germany could secure victory in time to neutralize this industrial gap. After their defeat in Tunisia, the answer was clear. They could not. This pattern appeared again and again over the course of the war. American troops stumbled at first, quickly learned, and consistently progressed. The same soldiers who had fled German armor in Tunisia would later invade at Normandy and push onward into France. Pilots who had initially been outclassed by veteran Luftwaffe flyers would ultimately help drive the German Air Force from the skies. This capacity for adaptation was embedded within American institutions. Ground Forces Command operated a constant loop of feedback from the battlefield back to training organizations. Reports from the front were scrutinized within weeks and incorporated into new instructional programs. Doctrine was modified as soon as battlefield realities dictated. Equipment was adjusted in response to problems brought up by soldiers under fire. While the system was not streamlined, often messy, with different units developing their own solutions to comparable problems, and coordination between branches sometimes lacking, the resulting disorder was productive. Effective solutions survived and proliferated, while failures were discarded. The larger structure improved, even when smaller parts struggled. By comparison, German military culture was rigid, tied to established doctrines and personal loyalty. Innovation was discouraged, and failure often spelled the end of careers. The very inflexibility that yielded Germany's early triumphs later became a hindrance as the conflict evolved. The Wehrmacht could carry out meticulously crafted plans, but faltered when forced to adapt. Hitler exacerbated these problems. His constant interference in operational decisions, making calls on gut feeling instead of rational analysis, taught his generals that dissent could end their service or worse. Objective assessments that could have redirected German strategy were routinely suppressed in favor of reports that only reinforced Hitler's expectations. Nowhere was the difference between American and German military cultures clearer than in how failure was treated. When U.S. officers failed, they were replaced rather than punished. General Lloyd Fredendall, who led the failure at Kasserine Pass, was simply relieved of command and assigned to train new soldiers in the U.S. Even his mistakes were seen as valuable experience. Conversely, when German commanders failed, their lives, not just careers, could be forfeit. After the failed assassination plot in July 1944, Hitler's suspicion deepened, and generals deemed untrustworthy were executed. Achieving victory did not ensure safety if it entailed overriding Hitler's directives. This fostered a conformist mindset just when adaptability was most needed. German officers who realized their situation was untenable often chose silence, since honesty was too dangerous. Information reaching Hitler had been sanitized by subordinates telling him what they thought he wanted, not what he actually needed. German generals who dismissed American combat skill at Kasserine would never radically revise their views. They chalked up U.S. success to sheer material abundance, refusing to recognize the role of organizational learning in converting that abundance into military power. Their confidence that German martial prowess would surpass American industrial strength persisted, even as U.S. forces pressed them back through France, across the Rhine, and into Germany's core. When D-Day commenced in June 1944, German officers stationed in France were caught off guard by the magnitude of the Allied landing force. On the first day, over 156,000 Allied soldiers came ashore, backed by nearly 7,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. The massive effort needed to transfer and sustain this force across the Channel and into occupied territory constituted an organizational feat German planners deemed unattainable. The American contribution was dominant. The vehicles used for the initial assault, landing craft, transports, tanks, and trucks mainly supplied by American factories. The bombardment ships were U.S. built. The overwhelming air presence originated from American production lines. German defenses put up fierce resistance in some areas, inflicting considerable casualties, but they were ultimately overcome by the Allies' sheer numbers and firepower. When an American infantry company encountered a fortified position, they would radio for artillery assistance. The resulting barrage was rarely a few shells, it was often hundreds, even thousands, of rounds blanketing and destroying enemy defenses. As the infantry moved forward, tanks provided cover. If tanks stalled, aircraft would then be called to intervene. The Americans had mastered coordinated arms operations, dramatically multiplying their combat impact. German veterans of the Eastern Front observed that American warfare differed from Soviet methods. Instead of sheer numbers, U.S. tactics emphasized machinery. Nevertheless, the result was the same: relentless application of overwhelming power, though at a lower human cost for the Americans. This was intentional. The U.S. military doctrine chose firepower over risking soldiers' lives. Why incur casualties when munitions could do the work instead? Hitler's strategic errors had consequences felt throughout the German war effort. Convinced the U.S. would not intervene effectively, he declared war on America just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, bringing an unnecessary adversary into the conflict. Believing that U.S. industry could not deliver on its promises, he let the U-boat campaign carry on far past its strategic benefit. Thinking American troops were weak, he delayed reinforcing the Western Front until it was already too late. Declaring war on the United States in December 1941 is regarded as one of the century's most puzzling strategic decisions. Germany's alliance with Japan via the Tripartite Pact did not require such action. Its terms committed the parties to mutual defense only if one was attacked, not the case when Japan struck out. Hitler could simply have stayed neutral with respect to America while Japan fought its Pacific battles. His advisors, including Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, reminded him that an American declaration would add another powerful enemy without bringing any real advantage. Nevertheless, Hitler brushed these warnings aside. He was convinced conflict with America was inevitable and preferred to act preemptively. More tellingly, he underestimated U.S. potential. He viewed the United States as a racially mixed, socially divided nation corrupted by Jewish influence incapable of meaningfully affecting the war's outcome. This deep-seated contempt infected German strategic thinking. Resources that could have boosted the U-boat fleet were allocated elsewhere, as the American industrial challenge wasn't taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have saved North Africa were instead sent eastward, since the Mediterranean theater was considered secondary.